SADC emergency mission to Zambia. Investigations begin ahead of 2026 election concerns. Good day, viewers. Welcome to another edition of the InspirAfrica official. I'm Nakash. We're stepping into the final days of November, and as the year winds down, the political temperature across southern Africa is heating up in ways that demand our attention. Today, we bring you a developing story that has sent ripples across the entire SADC region. A story of democracy under scrutiny, of elections yet to come, and of a regional body stepping in before the storm arrives. Picture this. In the heart of southern Africa, Zambia stands at a crossroads. The calendar shows 2026 is still months away, yet alarm bells are already ringing. International observers, regional partners, and democratic watchdogs are converging on Lusaka, not to celebrate, but to investigate. What has triggered this extraordinary intervention? What shadows are being cast over Zambia's electoral future before a single ballot has been printed? Is this a preemptive strike to safeguard democracy, or are we witnessing the early tremors of an electoral earthquake that could reshape southern African politics? What concerns are so grave that they've compelled the Southern African Development Community to deploy an emergency mission more than a year before citizens head to the polls? And perhaps most critically, what are they finding as they dig into Zambia's electoral machinery, its institutions, and the political landscape that will determine the nation's future? When regional bodies move with urgency before an election cycle begins, when investigations start before campaigns officially launch, when international eyes focus on a country's democratic infrastructure with this level of intensity, what does it tell us about the state of democracy itself? Are we looking at prevention, or are we already watching damage control? Subscribe to InspirAfrica Official for reliable, neutral, documentary-style political analysis. Factual foundation, background and timeline. The revelation came to light in mid-November 2025, when the Southern African Development Community announced the deployment of an emergency electoral assessment mission to Zambia. This extraordinary step comes nearly 18 months before Zambians are scheduled to head to the polls in August 2026. The mission, formerly known as the SADC Electoral Advisory Council Emergency Assessment Team, arrived in Lusaka on November 18, 2025. Led by former Botswana Electoral Commissioner Belisi Banyango, the team comprises electoral experts, legal scholars, and civil society observers from across the 15-member SADC bloc. Zambia, a landlocked nation of approximately 20 million people, has long been considered one of southern Africa's more stable democracies. The country has experienced multiple peaceful transitions of power since independence in 1964. Most recently, in August 2021, opposition leader Hakainde Hichilema defeated incumbent Edgar Lungu in an election that was largely praised by international observers. However, the political climate began shifting dramatically in early 2025. Opposition parties, led by the Patriotic Front, the party of former President Lungu, began raising concerns about what they termed systematic erosion of democratic space. These allegations included claims of media suppression, selective application of justice, and manipulation of electoral institutions. By September 2025, multiple opposition political parties had submitted a joint petition to the SADC Secretariat in Gaborone, Botswana. The petition outlined 17 specific concerns ranging from alleged bias within the Electoral Commission of Zambia to restrictions on opposition rallies and what they called weaponization of law enforcement against political dissent. The SADC organ on politics, defense, and security cooperation convened an emergency session in October 2025. Following deliberations that lasted 3 days, the body authorized the current investigative mission, a rare intervention that signals deep regional concern about Zambia's electoral trajectory. The mission's mandate is comprehensive: assess the independence and capacity of electoral institutions, evaluate the political and media environment, examine the legal framework governing elections, and determine whether conditions exist for free, fair, and credible elections in 2026. Direct evidence. In a press conference held at the Radisson Blu Hotel in Lusaka on November 20th, mission leader Belisi Banyango outlined the team's preliminary observations. We have been on the ground for approximately 48 hours, Banyango began, adjusting his reading glasses. What we can say at this juncture is that we have received extensive documentation from various stakeholders. The concerns raised are serious enough to warrant this level of scrutiny. When pressed by journalists about specific allegations, Banyango chose his words carefully. "We are examining claims related to the composition and the operational independence of the Electoral Commission of Zambia. There are also questions, legitimate questions, about media access, about the equitable distribution of campaign resources and opportunities. These are foundational issues for any democratic process." Opposition Patriotic Front Secretary General Raphael Nakasinda was more direct in his assessment during a separate interview with regional media outlets. "The Electoral Commission of Zambia has been completely captured," Nakasinda stated firmly. "Every single commissioner was appointed by the current administration. Every decision they make favors the ruling party. We have documented case after case where opposition events have been cancelled at the last minute, where our members have been arrested on spurious charges days before major rallies." He continued, his voice rising with emotion. "Just last month, October 15th to be exact, we had organized a national youth mobilization event in Kitwe. We had all the permits. We had followed every procedure. At midnight, 12 hours before the event, police surrounded our venue and declared it a security risk. No explanation, no recourse. This is the environment we are operating in." Representatives from the ruling United Party for National Development offered a starkly different narrative. Minister of Justice Malambo Haimbi addressed the mission directly during a closed-door session, excerpts of which were later shared with media. Let me be absolutely clear," Haimbi stated. "This government came to power on a platform of democratic renewal. We overthrew, through the ballot, mind you, we overthrew what was becoming an authoritarian regime. The irony of the Patriotic Front now crying about democratic spaces, frankly, it's astonishing." Haimbi went on to defend the government's record. "Every single restriction that has been placed on political activities has been done in accordance with the Public Order Act, which, I might remind everyone, was enacted by the previous government. We are simply enforcing existing law. If opposition parties cannot mobilize their supporters within the confines of the law, that is not a democratic deficit, that is a competence deficit." Electoral Commission of Zambia chairperson Mwangala Zalumis also met with the SADC mission. In a statement released afterward, she addressed the independence question head-on. I understand the optics," Zalumis acknowledged. "Yes, this commission was constituted under the current government. But I want to emphasize strongly, that our legal mandate makes us independent. We answer to the Constitution, not to any political party." However, when asked about specific decisions that opposition parties have challenged, Zalumis was less forthcoming. We have processes, internal processes for reviewing such concerns. Not every operational decision requires public justification. Civil society has provided perhaps the most detailed testimony. McDonald Chipenzi, Executive Director of the Zambia Council for Social Development, presented the SADC team with a 147-page dossier documenting what his organization calls democratic backsliding. "We are not taking sides," Chipenzi emphasized in his presentation. "But the data is undeniable. In 2024, there were 37 documented cases of opposition political events being disrupted or canceled by authorities. In the first 10 months of 2025, that number has risen to 81. This represents a 118% increase. These are not opinions. These are documented incidents with dates, locations, and official correspondence." Chipenzi also addressed media freedom. 3 independent radio stations have had their licenses suspended this year. 2 newspapers have faced criminal libel suits from government officials. Journalists covering opposition activities have reported harassment and intimidation. One of our media partners described it this way: "The space for critical journalism is shrinking daily." Deeper analysis. The SADC emergency mission represents more than just an assessment of Zambia's electoral preparedness. It signals a critical juncture for democracy across southern Africa. Regional analysts note that SADC's intervention is particularly significant given the organization's historical reluctance to criticize member states. Dr. Sishiwa, a political historian at the University of Zambia, offered this context. SADC has often been accused of being a club of incumbents, of protecting sitting presidents rather than protecting democracy. The fact that they have deployed this mission suggests either that the evidence is overwhelming, or that there has been a genuine shift in how the organization views its responsibility to democratic norms. The timing of the mission, arriving more than a year before the actual election, is both unusual and strategic. It allows for potential corrective measures but also risks politicizing the entire electoral process before it formally begins. Political risk analysts at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria argue that Zambia represents a test case for the region. If democratic standards erode in a country long considered a regional success story, it could embolden authoritarian tendencies elsewhere. Conversely, if SADC intervention leads to meaningful reforms, it could establish a precedent for proactive democratic protection. The economic implications are also substantial. Zambia is currently engaged in complex debt restructuring negotiations with international creditors. Political instability or questions about democratic legitimacy could complicate these negotiations and affect investor confidence. International development partners have expressed varying levels of concern. The European Union issued a diplomatic statement noting that it is closely monitoring developments and emphasizing the importance of credible electoral processes for continued partnership. The United States Embassy in Lusaka has been more direct, with the chargé d'affaires stating in a recent interview that democratic backsliding would have consequences for bilateral relations. However, significant ambiguities remain. The line between legitimate law enforcement and political suppression is often blurred, and both sides present evidence that supports their narrative. The Public Order Act, which governs political gatherings, contains provisions that can be interpreted broadly, giving authorities substantial discretionary power. Legal experts point out that many of the challenged restrictions are technically lawful under existing legislation, but legality and democratic health are not always synonymous. As constitutional lawyer John Sangwa noted in a recent opinion piece, a government can suffocate democracy while never breaking a single law, simply by enforcing selectively and interpreting maximally. The composition of the Electoral Commission remains perhaps the most contentious issue. While the current commissioners were appointed through constitutional processes, the lack of opposition input in their selection has created a perception of bias that may be as damaging as actual bias. There are also questions about what happens after the SADC mission concludes its work. If the report is critical, will the Zambian government implement recommendations? Does SADC have enforcement mechanisms? Or is this merely a fact-finding exercise with no teeth? And how will Zambian voters themselves interpret this regional intervention? As protection of their democratic rights or as external interference? The mission has already influenced political dynamics. Opposition parties are emboldened, viewing the SADC presence as validation of their concerns. The ruling party appears more defensive, increasingly framing criticism as attempts to delegitimize their electoral mandate. This polarization may itself complicate the path to a credible election. Perhaps most critically, this situation raises fundamental questions about democratic resilience. How do nations maintain democratic health between elections? What role should regional bodies play in preventive electoral diplomacy? And at what point does concern about future democratic violations become self-fulfilling, creating the very crisis it seeks to prevent? The SADC mission is expected to complete its assessment by mid-December and present findings to the SADC summit in early 2026. What those findings will reveal, and more importantly, what actions will follow, remains to be seen. What is clear is that Zambia's 2026 election has already become one of the most scrutinized electoral processes in Southern African history. And the first ballot hasn't even been cast. Thank you for watching this edition of InspirAfrica Official. This is a developing story, and we will continue to bring you updates as the SADC mission progresses and as Zambia moves toward what promises to be a pivotal election. What do you think about this regional intervention? Is SADC setting a positive precedent for protecting democracy, or does this represent an overreach into national sovereignty? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you, especially our viewers across the SADC region who understand these dynamics firsthand. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories that matter, more analysis that goes deeper, and more conversations that challenge us to think critically about the continent we call home. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep questioning. I'm Nakash, and this has been InspirAfrica Official.